What happens when a man tries to humiliate his ex-wife at the most public event of the year? Richard Sterling thought he had it all, a younger woman on his arm, and his boring ex-wife, Rosie, firmly in the past. He paraded his new life at the glittering St. Regis Gala, expecting everyone to admire him. But he made one critical mistake. He never imagined the woman he cast aside would re-emerge from the ashes of their marriage, not as a victim, but as a phoenix. Get ready for a story of betrayal, revenge, and a transformation so stunning it stopped the entire city in its tracks. The Crystal Ballroom at the St. Regis was a galaxy of its own, a universe where money and power orbited each other in a dizzying, dazzling dance. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls dripped light onto the city's elite. The air thick with the scent of expensive perfume and even more expensive ambitions hummed with the low murmur of conversations that could launch companies or end careers. Tonight was the annual Children's Foundation Gala, the undisputed apex of the social calendar, an event where being seen was as crucial as breathing. And no one understood that better than Richard Sterling. Richard, his silvering hair impeccably styled, his tuxedo tailored to within an inch of its life, surveyed the room with the proprietary air of a king examining his court. His hand rested possessively on the small of a much younger woman's back. This was Amber Collins, the press called her his companion. Richard preferred to think of her as his upgrade. With her fiery red dress clinging to a surgically perfected figure and her laughter loud and a little too bright, Amber was a living, breathing trophy. She was everything his ex-wife, Rosie, was not. "Isn't this divine?" Ricky Amber cooed, squeezing his arm as she spotted a congresswoman across the room. "Absolutely everyone is here." "They always are," Richard replied, his tone laced with the casual arrogance of a man who had never been denied anything. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning, assessing, cataloging. He was networking even in stillness. Every handshake was an investment, every smile a transaction. This gala wasn't just a party, it was a hunting ground. His gaze fell upon Jonathan Vance, a potential investor for his latest venture capital fund. "Excuse me for a moment, my dear," he murmured to Amber, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Work calls," Amber pouted prettily. "Don't be long. I feel so naked without you." Richard's answering smirk was thin. "You're never naked, darling. Not with that necklace on." He gestured to the cascade of diamonds encircling her throat, a piece that had once been a Sterling family heirloom, one he'd pointedly asked Rosie to return during their acrimonious divorce. Seeing it on Amber was a small, private victory that still brought him a sliver of satisfaction. As he moved through the crowd, a human shark parting the waters, he couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. Life was good. Better than good. He had shed 15 years of a dull, predictable marriage and emerged leaner, sharper, reborn. Rosie, with her quiet intelligence, her classic but understated style, her preference for a library over a limelight. She had become an anchor. He was a thoroughbred, he reasoned, and he'd been shackled to a plough horse. He remembered their last argument before the final separation. He had called her plain. "You're just plain, Rosie." He'd said the words, slithering out with a casual cruelty he'd perfected over the years. "You have no spark, no ambition. Look at you. You're content to just be." He had expected tears of fight something. Instead, she had looked at him with a strange, clear-eyed serenity that he found unnerving. "You're right, Richard," she had said softly. "I am content to be. I'm just no longer content to be with you." The memory still pricked at him, not with guilt, but with irritation. It was her lack of a dramatic reaction that bothered him. It was as if she had already left him long before he had walked out the door. Their divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. He'd been generous, of course, or at least his lawyers had framed it that way. He gave her the suburban house, a comfortable alimony. What more could she want? She was almost 40, a ghost in the social world she had never truly embraced. Her life, he imagined, had shrunk, collapsing into a quiet beige existence of book clubs and gardening. The thought was vaguely comforting. "Richard, good to see you." Jonathan Vance greeted him with a hearty clap on the shoulder. Vance was old money, a man whose respect Richard craved. "Jonathan, you're looking well. The market must be agreeing with you." They exchanged the practiced pleasantries of their class, their conversation, a carefully choreographed dance of subtle boasts and probing questions. Richard was in his element. He was charming, witty, dropping the right names, laughing at the right jokes. Amber had rejoined him, clinging to his arm, playing her part as the beautiful, adoring accessory. "And this must be the lovely Amber," Vance said, his eyes giving her a quick, almost imperceptible once-over. "So lovely to finally meet you," Amber gushed. "I've heard so much about you. Ricky is always talking about your incredible business acumen." Richard cringed internally at the Ricky. It sounded so juvenile. Rosie had always called him Richard. "Well, you've certainly landed a good one," Vance said, turning back to Richard, a hint of something unreadable in his expression. "Though I must say, I was always very fond of Rosie. A class act, that woman. How is she doing?" The question was a landmine. Richard forced a nonchalant smile. "Rosie? Oh, she's fine, doing well. You know her, happy with the simple life." He made a vague gesture with his hand, as if describing a small, uninteresting creature. "I doubt this sort of thing is her scene anymore." "A shame," Vance said, his gaze drifting towards the grand entrance of the ballroom. "She had one of the sharpest minds I've ever encountered. Her insights on the board of the museum were invaluable." Richard felt a familiar flicker of resentment. People had always said that about Rosie. They'd praised her intelligence, her grace, her quiet dignity. He'd seen it as a reflection on him, a testament to his good taste. But over time, it had begun to feel like a competition he was losing. She had a light of her own, and he had wanted to be the only sun in their universe. "Well, she's focused on other things now," he said dismissively, eager to change the subject. "Now about that new tech fund." But Vance wasn't listening. His attention, along with that of several others nearby, was fixed on the massive ornate doors of the ballroom. A hush was beginning to fall, a ripple of silence spreading outwards from the entrance as heads began to turn. Richard followed their gaze, annoyed at the interruption. The arrival of a latecomer, no matter how important, rarely caused this kind of stir. A politician maybe, a visiting royal, the crowd, near the entrance, parted slowly like the Red Sea, and through the gap, a figure emerged. For a moment, Richard's brain refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a woman. But that was too simple a word. She was a vision, a spectre of impossible elegance, gliding into the room. She wore a gown the color of midnight, a swath of deep blue silk that seemed to drink the light. It was cut with an audacious simplicity that screamed couture, clinging to curves he didn't know existed, and pooling at her feet like liquid shadow. A single breathtaking diamond necklace, far more spectacular than the one on Amber's neck, rested against her collarbone. Her hair, which she used to wear in a sensible shoulder-length cut, was swept up in a complex yet effortless-looking chignon, revealing the graceful line of her neck. But it was her face that caused the air to leave Richard's lungs. The face was familiar, but the expression was not. The quiet, almost timid woman he had divorced was gone. In her place was a woman of supreme, unshakable confidence. Her makeup was subtle, yet transformative, emphasizing high cheekbones he'd forgotten she had, and eyes that now seemed to hold a universe of secrets. And she was smiling. Not the gentle, accommodating smile he remembered, but a small, knowing smile of a woman who knew her own worth. Amber, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, whispered, "Who is that? She looks like a movie star." Richard couldn't answer. He couldn't breathe. His champagne glass felt impossibly heavy in his suddenly nerveless hand. The room, with its hundreds of powerful guests, its cascading chandeliers, and its buzz of importance, seemed to fade into the background. There was only the woman in the midnight blue dress, because he knew who she was. As she took another step into the room, a collective gasp seemed to follow her. People were not just looking, they were staring. Whispers erupted, spreading through the ballroom like wildfire. "Is that, my God, it can't be, Rosie Sterling." And as his name echoed through the stunned silence, Richard Sterling felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. This wasn't the plain, simple ex-wife he had relegated to the suburbs of his memory. This was a stranger, a goddess, a reckoning. This was Rosie, and she had just walked back into his life. Rosie felt the weight of their stares like a physical touch, 1,000 invisible hands brushing against her skin. 6 months ago, it would have sent her scurrying for the nearest exit, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Tonight, she welcomed it. She absorbed it. It was fuel. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind for weeks, playing it over and over again until the fear had been worn down into a smooth, hard stone of resolve in her gut. The walk from the car to the ballroom entrance had been the longest of her life. Her hands, encased in long silk gloves, had trembled slightly as she'd given her name at the check-in. The woman's eyes had widened in recognition, the first small tremor of the earthquake she was about to cause. Now, standing at the precipice of her old life, she paused, a deliberate, calculated hesitation. She let them look. She let them drink in the transformation. The Rosie they remembered was a woman who had perfected the art of being unobtrusive, of blending into the wallpaper of her own life. She had worn muted colors, sensible heels, and an expression of polite reserve. She had been Mrs. Richard Sterling, a role, not a person. The woman standing before them now was a masterpiece of defiance. The midnight blue gown, a custom creation by a daring young designer named Marco Valenti, was a statement. It was bold, elegant, and unapologetically sensual. The slit that ran up the side, invisible when she stood still, flashed a tantalizing glimpse of a toned leg as she moved. The diamond necklace, the starlight cascade, was on loan from a high-end jeweler, a friend of a friend. It wasn't a family heirloom passed down by a man. It was a temporary crown she had chosen for herself. Her transformation was more than just clothes and jewels. It was in her posture, the straightness of her spine, the confident set of her shoulders. It was in the tilt of her head, the calm, sweeping gaze with which she surveyed the room. The months since the divorce had been a period of intense, painful, and ultimately liberating reconstruction. She had hired a personal trainer not to please a man, but to feel strong in her own body. She had worked with a stylist not to fit in, but to discover what made her feel beautiful. She had spent hours in therapy, excavating the woman she had buried under 15 years of Richard's casual dismissals and subtle belittlements. She saw him then, across the sea of frozen faces. He was standing next to the redhead, the one she'd seen in paparazzi photos. The woman looked like a cheap imitation of the glamour Rosie was now effortlessly radiating. But it was Richard's face that she focused on. The slack-jawed shock, the flicker of disbelief warring with cold, hard fury in his eyes. It was more satisfying than she had dared to imagine. A slow smile touched Rosie's lips, a genuine one this time. She took her first step into the ballroom and the spell was broken. The whispers erupted into a roar. Rosie Sterling, I don't believe it. What has she done? She looks incredible. Richard must be choking on his champagne. The last comment came from Beatrice Fairfax, the city's foremost gossip columnist, her eyes gleaming with professional delight. This was not just a social event anymore. It was a story. Rosie glided through the crowd, a serene smile fixed on her face. People she had known for years approached her with a newfound deference. The women who had once pitied her now looked at her with a mixture of awe and envy. The men who had barely noticed her before were now stumbling over themselves to catch her eye. Rosie, darling, you look absolutely breathtaking, gushed a woman whose name escaped her. Thank you, Carol, Rosie, said her voice smooth and even. She had made a point to remember the names of those who had been kind to her and to pointedly forget those who had followed Richard's lead in dismissing her. She was making her way towards the bar when a man stepped into her path, blocking her way. He was tall, with a rugged, handsome face that stood out amongst the soft, pampered men of Richard's circle. He had dark, intelligent eyes that held a hint of amusement. I apologize for being so forward, he said, his voice a low, pleasant baritone. But I have to say, your entrance was the most compelling thing I have seen all year. My name is Julian Croft. Rosie recognized the name immediately. Julian Croft was a self-made man, a tech billionaire who had a reputation for being brilliant, reclusive, and utterly uninterested in the city's social games. He rarely attended these events. Rosie Sterling, she replied, extending her gloved hand. He took it, his grip warm and firm. He didn't bow over it in the flamboyant European style some men affected. He just held it for a moment, his eyes never leaving hers. I know who you are, Mrs. Sterling. Or is it Ms. Sterling now, Ms. Sterling, she confirmed, a spark of pleasure running through her at the simple affirmation. And please call me Rosie. Rosie, he repeated as if testing the name. It suits you. Far better than the whispers I've been hearing. And what whispers are those, Mr. Croft, that you were a ghost? It seems the reports of your demise were greatly exaggerated. His smile was warm and genuine, and for the first time that evening, Rosie felt herself truly relax. Across the room, Richard watched this exchange with a mounting sense of rage. Who the hell was that man talking to his Rosie? Not his anymore. A nasty little voice in his head reminded him, but the possessive instinct was deeply ingrained. He saw the way the man was looking at her, the way she was smiling at him. It was a kind of easy, intimate rapport that he and Rosie hadn't shared in years. Ricky, who is she talking to? Amber's voice was shrill, cutting through his red-misted haze. And why is everyone staring at her? It's just your frumpy ex-wife. She got a new dress, so what? Shut up, Amber. Richard snapped, his voice a low hiss. Amber recoiled, her eyes welling with tears. Don't you talk to me like that. But Richard was no longer paying attention to her. He was watching Rosie and Julian Croft. He watched as Julian laughed, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to draw Rosie in. He watched as Julian gestured to the bar and offered her his arm. And he watched as Rosie took it, her gloved fingers resting on his forearm as they walked away together, the center of their own universe in the middle of the crowded room. The sight was a physical blow. He had created this narrative in his head, a story where he was the victor, the one who had escaped a dull life for a brighter, more exciting one. Rosie was supposed to be the tragic figure, the forgotten wife, fading into obscurity. But the woman in the midnight blue dress was not tragic. She was triumphant. And her triumph, he realized with a sickening jolt, was his humiliation. "Richard, I can't believe it's her," Jonathan Vance said, reappearing at his side. He wasn't looking at Richard. His eyes were fixed on Rosie. "My God, she's magnificent." The word hung in the air between them, a judgment and a verdict. Magnificent. It was the last word in the world Richard Sterling wanted to hear used to describe the woman he had thrown away. The gala, which had begun as his victory lap, was rapidly turning into his personal hell, and the night he suspected was far from over. The conversation with Julian Croft was like a cool drink of water after a decade in the desert. He didn't talk about the past, didn't ask prying questions, didn't treat her like a spectacle. He talked about art, about a recent trip to Kyoto, about the ridiculousness of the canapes. He was funny, self-deprecating, and he listened, truly listened, when she spoke. "So what's your story, Rosie Sterling?" he asked as they found a quieter corner near the terrace away from the main crush. "And I don't mean the one everyone in this room is currently writing in their heads." Rosie took a sip of the champagne he'd procured for her. It tasted like victory. "I'm a woman who decided to read a different book," she said simply. Julian's eyes crinkled at the corners. "I like that. Most people here just keep rereading the same page." "So you're an editor? A publisher?" "No," she smiled. "Just a connoisseur of new chapters." The confidence felt foreign and exhilarating on her tongue. 6 months ago, she would have mumbled something about being a mother and a former board member. Tonight, she was the protagonist. Their easy laughter and palpable chemistry did not go unnoticed. Beatrice Fairfax was scribbling furiously in her notepad. Amber was shooting daggers from across the room, her face a mask of furious disbelief. But the most intense gaze came from Richard. He was watching them with a burning laser-like focus, his knuckles white as he gripped his glass. He couldn't stand it. He had to reassert control. He had to put her back in her box. Excusing himself from a now sniffling Amber, he strode across the ballroom, his path clearing before him as people sensed the impending confrontation. He reached Rosie and Julian just as Julian was recounting a disastrous sailing trip. "Rosie," Richard said, his voice tight. He pointedly ignored Julian, as if he were a piece of furniture. "I need to speak with you." Rosie turned to him slowly, her expression one of polite inquiry, as if addressing a stranger who'd asked for directions. "Richard, I'm sorry, I'm in the middle of a conversation." The dismissal, so cool and public, stunned him. "This will only take a moment. It's important." "I'm sure it is," she replied, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "But as you can see, I'm otherwise engaged." She then turned her back on him, a gesture so final and dismissive it was like a slap in the face. She smiled brightly at Julian. "You were saying something about a seagull, and your hat," Julian, to his credit, picked up the thread of his story without missing a beat, though his eyes danced with amusement. The message was clear. Richard Sterling had no power here. Humiliation burned in Richard's gut, hot and acidic. He was used to being the center of attention, the one who commanded respect. To be dismissed so casually by her in front of a man like Julian Croft, it was intolerable. He stood there for a moment, floundering, before retreating in a haze of fury, His retreat took him straight into the path of a furious Amber. "What was that?" she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "She just turned her back on you. Are you going to let her get away with that? And who is that man she's with?" "It doesn't matter who he is," Richard snarled, grabbing her arm a little too tightly. "It's a pathetic attempt to make me jealous. It's so transparent." Jealous Amber laughed, a shrill, ugly sound. "She's making you look like a fool, Ricky. Everyone is talking about it. They're laughing at you. At us." The accusation hit a raw nerve. "Don't be ridiculous. No one is laughing at me." But as he looked around, he saw that she was right. The whispers hadn't died down. They had changed in tone. The shock had given way to amusement, to a schadenfreude that was palpable. He saw smirks on the faces of his rivals, pitying looks from his allies. He, Richard Sterling, the master of the universe, had become the butt of the joke at his own coronation. The root of it all, he knew, was Rosie. This entire fiasco was her fault. This calculated theatrical display was designed for one purpose: to humiliate him. He thought back to their marriage, to the countless times he had made her feel small, insignificant. He'd seen it as necessary a way of maintaining the natural order of things. He was the star. She was the supporting cast. He remembered a specific incident about 2 years before the divorce. He had been up for a major promotion, a seat on the executive board. The final decision was coming down to him and another colleague. The CEO, a man named George Hamid, had hosted a dinner party for the finalists. Rosie had been seated next to Hamid, and she had, in her quiet way, charmed him. They had discussed modern art, a passion of Hamid's that Richard had always found tedious. The next day, Hamid had called Richard. "Your wife is a remarkable woman, Richard," he'd said, "incredibly bright. Her insights on the new acquisitions for the gallery were fascinating. You're a lucky man." Richard had gotten the promotion, but the praise for Rosie had soured the victory. It felt as though he had won on her coattails. That night, he had been cruel to her. "Don't think that little performance last night meant anything," he'd sneered. "Hamid was just being polite. Stick to what you're good at: planning menus and looking pretty. Leave the thinking to me." She had flinched, her eyes clouding with a hurt that he had at the time found strangely satisfying. It had put her back in her place. Now, seeing her across the room, radiating a confidence that seemed to eclipse the light from the chandeliers, he realized how wrong he had been. He hadn't been putting her in her place. He had been trying to extinguish her light because he was afraid it would outshine his own. His simmering rage needed an outlet, and Amber was the closest target. "This is your fault," he seethed, turning on her. "That ridiculous dress. You look like a Christmas ornament." "My fault," Amber shrieked, her voice attracting more unwanted attention. "You're the one whose ex-wife just showed up looking like a goddess, and you're blaming my dress." She gestured wildly towards Rosie. "Go do something. Don't just stand here and let her win." "It's not a competition," he insisted, even as he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that it was. And he was losing. Meanwhile, Rosie was learning things. Julian Croft, it turned out, was on the board of the Children's Foundation. He was a major donor, but he usually sent a proxy to the gala. "What made you decide to come in person this year?" Rosie asked. Julian's gaze was direct. "I heard a rumor that the foundation was about to get a new, very dynamic board member. I was curious to meet her." He paused, a smile playing on his lips. "I believe her name is Rosie Sterling." Rosie's carefully constructed composure almost slipped. "You knew I may have had a hand in your nomination," he admitted. "I was on the committee. When your name came up, I remembered Jonathan Vance mentioning you. I did a little research." A woman who helped turn the City Museum's finances around with her fundraising strategies, who speaks 3 languages, and who has a degree in art history from the Sorbonne. You weren't just qualified, Rosie. You were a secret weapon they didn't even know they had. The validation was so profound, so unexpected, that Rosie felt a prickle of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them away fiercely. She would not cry. Not tonight. Richard never mentioned my work with the museum, she said softly, more to herself than to him. I'm beginning to suspect, Julian said, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, that there's a great deal about you that Richard Sterling never appreciated. The warmth in his eyes was a balm on a wound she hadn't realized was still so raw. It was in that moment that she knew her transformation was complete. It wasn't about the dress or the necklace or the stairs. It was about this being seen, truly seen, for who she was. The evening was just getting started. The main event, the charity auction, was about to begin, and Rosie had a feeling that the real bidding had yet to commence. The charity auction was the centerpiece of the gala, a high-stakes performance where fortunes were flaunted and egos were put on the line, all under the guise of philanthropy. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a slick smile, took the stage, and a hush fell over the room. Richard, who had always dominated these events with his aggressive, almost brutalist bidding style, felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was his arena. He could reclaim his power here. The first few items, a week in a Tuscan villa, a set of vintage wines, went for predictable astronomical sums. Richard made a point of winning a particularly coveted item, a private dinner with a celebrity chef, bidding far more than it was worth just to show he could. He shot a triumphant look towards Rosie, but she wasn't even watching him. She was in a quiet, intense conversation with Julian Croft, both of them occasionally glancing at the auction catalogue. Then the final premier item was announced. It was a stunning abstract painting by a celebrated contemporary artist, piece that had been the talk of the art world. We'll start the bidding for Phoenix Rising at $100,000, the auctioneer announced. A paddle went up immediately. Julian Croft's. 200,000, he said, his voice calm and clear. Richard's head snapped towards him. He hadn't expected Croft to be interested. Richard saw himself as a patron of the arts. Croft was a tech guy, all circuits and code. Another bidder raised the price, then another. The bidding quickly climbed, a rapid-fire exchange between a handful of the city's wealthiest collectors. Richard stayed silent, watching, waiting for his moment to strike. He would let them tire themselves out, then sweep in at the end and take the prize. It was his signature move. The bidding reached $450,000, and the room grew quiet. It seemed to be stalled between 2 determined bidders. 450 going once, the auctioneer began. Richard raised his paddle. 500,000, he declared, his voice booming through the ballroom. A ripple of appreciation went through the crowd. This was the Richard Sterling they knew. One of the other bidders dropped out. The other hesitated, then shook his head. 500,000 going once, going twice. The auctioneer looked at Julian, who had not made a move since his initial bid. Julian simply smiled and gave a slight shake of his head. Victory surged through Richard. He had won. He had proven his dominance. He glanced at Rosie, a smug, victorious smile on his face. And then a new paddle went up, a paddle held by a hand in a long, midnight blue glove. 600,000, Rosie said, her voice not loud, but carrying an authority that cut through the silence like a diamond. The entire room seemed to suck in a collective breath. All eyes swiveled from Richard to Rosie and back again. This was no longer an auction. It was a duel. Richard was thunderstruck. What was she doing? She couldn't afford this. Her alimony was generous, but it wasn't buy a major work of art at a whim generous. This was a stunt, a bluff. She was trying to drive up the price to make him pay more. Rage, pure and undiluted, flooded him. He would not be played. He raised his paddle again, his hand shaking slightly. 700,000. Rosie didn't even blink. 800,000. Amber was tugging at his sleeve, her eyes wide with panic. "Ricky, stop! What are you doing?" she whispered frantically. "It's just a painting." He shook her off. It was never just a painting. It was about pride, about power, about putting Rosie back in the place he had assigned her. $1 million, Richard snarled, throwing the number down like a gauntlet. The room erupted in gasps. $1 million for a painting at a charity auction was almost unheard of. It was a reckless, ego-driven move, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop himself. He stared at Rosie, daring her to continue. He saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not fear, but something else he couldn't read. She looked at Julian, who gave her the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. She lowered her paddle. "The gentleman has made his point," she said, her voice laced with a cool amusement that was more infuriating than any anger. She turned to Julian. "It seems he wanted it more than I did." Richard had won. He had the painting. But as the auctioneer slammed the gavel down and announced him the winner, the victory felt hollow metallic in his mouth. He had just spent $1 million on a painting he didn't even particularly like, all to win a battle she had started. The applause felt thin, mocking. He had shown his strength, but he had also shown his weakness. He had shown the entire world how much his ex-wife could still get under his skin. Later, as people were mingling before the final speeches, Richard cornered her near the terrace. The fury he had been simmering all night was ready to boil over. "What in the hell was that?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. "That was a childish, pathetic game, Rosie. You knew you couldn't afford that painting. You did it just to make me look like a fool." Rosie looked at him, and for the first time he saw a hint of the fire that had been banked for so long. "You're wrong, Richard," she said, her voice cold as ice. "I wasn't trying to make you look like a fool. You do a perfectly adequate job of that all by yourself. I was just revealing your character to the room." "My character," he scoffed. Yes, a man so insecure he'd rather spend $1 million than be seen losing to his ex-wife. A man so obsessed with control he can't stand to see me breathe the same air as him without trying to assert his dominance. She took a step closer, and he was taken aback by the intensity of her gaze. "You didn't see me as a wife, Richard. You saw me as a possession. And you can't stand the fact that your possession has learned to walk away." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, puncturing his pride, his ego, his carefully constructed self-image. "And as for affording it," she continued, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips, "you seem to have forgotten about the inheritance my grandmother left me. The one I never touched, because you told me we didn't need it, that you would provide for us. It seems my plain little life had a few secrets you weren't privy to." She paused, letting the information sink in. "Oh, and by the way, the artist Jean-Paul Dubois, he's an old friend from my time at the Sorbonne. He donated the painting on the condition that I be the one to present it. The bidding war was just a little performance art. All proceeds go to the children, of course. Your $1 million will do a lot of good." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He had been played, masterfully, utterly. He wasn't the victor. He was the mark. She hadn't been bidding against him for the painting. She had been using him to raise the price for a cause she championed with a painting donated by her friend. You, he stammered, speechless, with rage and humiliation. Me, she said softly. She looked past him, her eyes finding Julian, who was watching them from a distance, with a look of profound admiration. Now, if you'll excuse me, the Foundation's new board member has a speech to give. She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his million-dollar victory feeling like a jester's cap on his head. He was Richard Sterling. He never lost. But as he watched Rosie take the stage to a round of thunderous applause, he knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the diamond on her neck that he had just lost something far more valuable than money. He had lost the war. The stage lights seemed to possess a consciousness of their own, seeking out Rosie and bathing her in a warm, impossibly golden glow. In their spotlight, the midnight blue of her dress deepened into the color of a fathomless ocean, and the starlight cascade at her throat fractured the light into 1,000 tiny, brilliant rainbows that danced across her skin. She didn't just look regal, she looked anointed. Serene, powerful, and utterly in command, she was the still point in the turning world of the crystal ballroom. The applause that greeted her was not the polite obligatory clapping for a donor's speech. It was a roar, a wave of genuine electric enthusiasm from a room that knew it was witnessing something seismic. It was the sound of a verdict being rendered. Richard stood frozen amidst the glittering throng, a ghost at a feast he had meticulously planned for himself. The champagne in his glass had gone warm, its bubbles dead. Amber, a splash of garish red in his peripheral vision, had long since detached herself from his side. He watched her melt into a clique of women who were now shooting him glances that were a poisonous cocktail of pity and morbid curiosity. He was an island, a rapidly eroding one, and the tide of public opinion was rushing out, leaving the jagged, ugly bedrock of his folly exposed for all to see. He had never felt so alone, in a room so full of people he knew. "Good evening," Rosie began. Her voice, amplified by the microphone, lost none of its intimate warmth. It resonated through the vast ballroom, a calm, clear tone that effortlessly commanded the attention of everyone present. For 15 years, I attended this gala on the arm of a powerful man. I wore beautiful dresses, I smiled at the right people, and I wrote checks. I believed that was the scope of my ability to contribute. I was a passenger in my own life. Her eyes, calm and deliberate, swept the room, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, they met Richard's. There was no malice in her gaze, no gloating triumph he could have armed himself against. There was only a kind of sad, piercing clarity, the look of someone seeing him for exactly what he was and finding him wanting. It was a look that stripped him bare. "It's easy to become a passenger," she continued, her voice drawing them in. "In fact, it's the most comfortable thing in the world. It's safe. You let someone else do the driving, hold the map, choose the destination. You forget the power of your own 2 feet, the strength in your own voice. You forget you even have a choice, but then, one day, the car stops. You find yourself standing on the side of the road, alone, with the dust settling around you. And in that silence, you have a choice. You can wait for another car to come along and hope it's going your way, or you can start walking." A murmur of profound understanding rippled through the audience. This was a language that transcended wealth and status. It spoke to the woman whose husband made all the decisions, the man whose career was dictated by his father, the artist who had given up their dreams for a steady paycheck. Every person in that room, in some corner of their heart, understood the metaphor of the abandoned passenger. "I started walking," Rosie said, a new strength infusing her words. "And I discovered something wonderful. I discovered that my own 2 feet were stronger than I ever imagined, that my own voice, once I chose to use it, could speak volumes. I discovered that the destination I chose for myself was far more beautiful, more vibrant, more real than any place I had ever been driven to." And most importantly, her gaze shifted then, effortlessly finding Julian Croft in the crowd. He was leaning against a marble pillar, his arms crossed, a look of profound respect and admiration on his face. He gave her a small, encouraging smile that was just for her. "I discovered that I wasn't walking alone. Tonight, this foundation, which is so dear to my heart, has raised a record-breaking amount of money," she announced, her voice swelling with a pride that was infectious. "And it's thanks, in no small part, to the extraordinary, if somewhat spirited but generosity of Mr. Richard Sterling." A wave of laughter, light, genuine and cathartic, filled the room. It wasn't entirely mocking. It was too appreciative for that. It was the laughter of people who had witnessed a master storyteller deliver the perfect, satisfying punchline. Richard felt his face burn, with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. She was thanking him, but it was the most devastating, elegant condemnation he had ever received. With a few perfectly chosen words, she had framed his ego-driven folly not as a moment of weakness, but as a calculated act of philanthropy she had orchestrated. She was using the rubble of his pride as the foundation for her triumph. His $1 million contribution for Phoenix Rising, a rather aptly named piece, I think, she added with the faintest hint of a smile, will allow us to break ground on a project we have been dreaming of for years. It will fully fund the construction of a new state-of-the-art wing for the Children's Hospital. The applause was thunderous now, a testament to the scale of the donation. Richard felt a wave of nausea, so intense he had to grip the back of a nearby chair to steady himself. His name, his money, his act of public dominance, all of it had been hijacked. "And so," Rosie concluded, her voice ringing with finality, "I am thrilled and deeply honored to announce that the new wing will be named the Sterling Wing. Checkmate." It was a move so brilliant, so complete in its strategic cruelty, that a part of him could only stand in stunned admiration. He felt the gazes of hundreds of people on him, expecting him to look pleased, proud. He was trapped. His name would now be forever attached to a building that would stand as a permanent brick-and-mortar monument to his public humiliation at her hands. She hadn't just defeated him, she had erased his narrative, co-opting his very name, the symbol of his power, and making it a symbol of her victory and his folly. She finished her speech with an eloquent and moving plea for continued support, but Richard heard none of it. He was lost in the roaring silence of his own defeat. When she was done, the room rose as one to its feet in a thunderous, sustained, standing ovation. It wasn't for Mrs. Richard Sterling, the quiet, decorative wife. It was for Rosie Sterling, the Phoenix, who had not only risen from the ashes, but had used the fire that was meant to consume her to forge herself anew. As she stepped down from the stage, she was immediately enveloped by a crowd of well-wishers. Jonathan Vance was one of the first to reach her, his face beaming. "Rosie," he said, taking both her hands in his. "That was masterful, simply masterful. Your mother always said you had a steel spine. She would have been so incredibly proud tonight." Julian was waiting for her at the edge of the adoring crowd. He didn't need to push his way through. He simply waited a calm, steady presence. When she finally broke free, he didn't say anything. He just offered her his arm, a silent gesture of partnership that was more potent than any words of praise. She took it without hesitation, and together they walked towards the grand doors of the terrace, away from the noise and the lights into the cool, quiet promise of the night air. Richard finally moved his limbs, feeling heavy, disconnected. He walked almost in a trance out of the ballroom. He didn't bother to look for Amber. He knew what he would find: cold calculation. The trophy had seen the champion fall, and her loyalty, always a transactional commodity, was dissolving with his perceived power. Theirs was a contract, and he had just irrevocably breached its primary clause: invincibility. He stepped outside into the valet area. The crisp night air was a shock, slicing through the overheated fog of the ballroom and his own private hell. And then he saw them. Rosie and Julian were standing by a sleek black car, its engine purring softly. Julian was holding the door for her, his posture one of easy, confident grace. Before she got in, she turned as if she sensed his presence across the expanse of polished concrete and luxury cars. Her eyes met his. In that moment, he searched her face for any sign of the old battles: anger, hatred, resentment, even a flicker of smug satisfaction. He found none of it. He saw something far more devastating: a serene, settled indifference. It was the look of a person for whom he was no longer a major character, not even a villain. He had been demoted to a footnote in a story that was no longer about him. The story of Richard and Rosie was over. This was the first page of the story of Rosie. She gave him a final small nod. It was not a gesture of forgiveness nor of truce. It was a gesture of dismissal, final, absolute, and complete. Then she slid into the car, a queen, leaving a conquered battlefield. Her victory not just absolute, but effortless. As the car pulled away, its red taillights disappearing into the glittering, indifferent labyrinth of the city, Richard Sterling finally understood everything. He hadn't just lost a wife. He hadn't just lost $1 million. He had lost the best part of himself, the part he had never bothered to know. He had traded a rare, flawless diamond for a piece of shining glass, and he hadn't even realized his own poverty until he saw the diamond shining in someone else's light. He was left alone in the dark, with the hollow echo of applause for a triumph that was not his, and the bitter, metallic taste of $1 million mistake. The king was alone in his gilded cage, and for the first time, with a clarity that shattered him, he realized the door had been open all along. He had just been too blind, too arrogant, too in love with the reflection in the bars to ever think of walking out. And that's how a woman who was cast aside as plain and boring showed an entire city that the most dazzling transformations don't come from a new dress or a new man, but from the quiet, unshakable discovery of your own worth. Rosie Sterling's story isn't just about revenge, it's about reclamation. It's about taking back the pen and writing your own story in your own words, on your own terms. She didn't just win the night, she won back her life, and in doing so, created a legend. What did you think of Rosie's epic comeback? Was Richard a villain, or just a fool who threw away his greatest treasure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love stories of empowerment, intricate drama, and the sweetest, most satisfying karma, make sure you hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life dramas that will have you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what we have in store for you next.
The courtroom air was thick with contempt, and every bit of it was aimed at Evelyn Vance. Her simple second-hand dress seemed to shrink under the weight of a dozen judgmental stares. Across the room, her ex-husband Julian Thorne sat beside his new fiancée, a woman draped in diamonds and disdain. They were there to finalize a divorce, but for them it was a victory lap. They were about to paint Evelyn as a worthless, leeching spouse who deserved nothing. Julian's lawyer was a shark circling ready to tear her apart in front of the judge. What could be more humiliating than being publicly destroyed by the man you once built a life with? They thought they knew everything about the quiet, timid woman they were casting aside. They were about to learn how devastatingly wrong they were. The sterile chill of courtroom 4B clung to Evelyn Vance's skin. It was a coldness that had nothing to do with the building's aggressive air conditioning and everything to do with the palpable scorn directed at her. She sat alone at the respondent's table, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white mountains on a pale landscape. Her lawyer, a young and earnest but visibly overwhelmed public defender named Sarah Jenkins, shuffled papers beside her, the rustling sound amplifying the silence. Across the aisle was the source of her current misery. Julian Thorne, her soon-to-be ex-husband, looked every bit the man of success she had helped him become. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, its dark charcoal fabric a testament to a world she was no longer a part of. Beside him, his fiancée Isabella Sterling was a portrait of condescending perfection. Her blonde hair was styled in a severe, elegant chignon, her pearl earrings catching the fluorescent light, and a smug little smile played on her lips as she occasionally leaned over to whisper in Julian's ear. They looked like a power couple on the cover of a business magazine. Evelyn, in her $15 thrift store dress, felt like a ghost haunting their triumph. "Your Honor," began Marcus Finch, Julian's lawyer. He was a man whose expensive cologne preceded him, a slick, silver-haired predator with a voice as smooth and dangerous as black ice. "We are here today to dissolve the marriage between my client, Mr. Julian Thorne, and the respondent, Ms. Evelyn Vance. But more specifically, we are here to address Ms. Vance's utterly baseless and frankly insulting claim for spousal support." Finch paced before the judge's bench, his movements theatrical and confident. "Mr. Thorne, through sheer brilliance and relentless hard work, has built a successful boutique investment firm, Thorne Capital. He is a pillar of the financial community. Ms. Vance, on the other hand—" He paused, turning to gesture dismissively at Evelyn. "Contributed nothing. In the 5 years of their marriage, she held a series of menial part-time jobs. A barista here, a bookstore clerk there, never showing any ambition, any drive. She was to be blunt, a domestic anchor on a man destined for the stratosphere." Evelyn flinched as if struck. A domestic anchor. Was that what she was? She thought of the countless nights she'd worked double shifts at the diner, the scent of grease clinging to her hair, so Julian could afford the subscription to the Wall Street Journal and the data terminals he needed. She remembered selling her late mother's locket, the only piece of real jewelry she owned, to pay for the deposit on his first office space. He'd called her his angel investor, then kissing her hands and promising her the world. Furthermore, Finch continued, his voice dripping with theatrical pity, "Ms. Vance has made no effort to become self-sufficient since their separation 6 months ago. She lives in a rundown apartment, works minimal hours at a local library, and seems to expect my client, a man she emotionally abandoned long ago, to fund her unambitious lifestyle indefinitely. It is not just unreasonable. Your Honor, it is parasitic." Isabella Sterling let out a soft, delicate scoff, just loud enough for Evelyn to hear. She glanced at Julian, who refused to meet her eyes, instead staring at the judge with a look of pained sincerity. He was playing the victim, the magnanimous genius held back by a simple, grasping woman. "We have bank statements, employment records," Finch said, slapping a folder onto the clerk's desk. "They will show a woman content with mediocrity while my client built an empire. To award her alimony would be to reward indolence. We propose a one-time settlement of $5,000, a generous offer to help her get on her feet. And nothing more. $5,000. For 5 years of her life. For sacrificing her own dreams, for believing in his." A bitter laugh almost escaped Evelyn's lips. It was less than the cost of the watch on Isabella's wrist. The judge, a stern-faced woman named Judge Miller, peered down at Evelyn over her glasses. "Ms. Vance, your lawyer's initial filing requested 50% of all assets acquired during the marriage and ongoing alimony of $10,000 a month. Mr. Finch presents a very different picture of your contributions. Do you have a response?" Evelyn's throat felt like it was filled with sand. All eyes were on her. She could feel the weight of their judgment, their belief that she was exactly what Finch had painted her to be, a pathetic failure clinging to a successful man's coattails. "Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins began, her voice a little shaky, "my client supported Mr. Thorne emotionally and financially in the early years. Her income, while modest, paid for their living expenses, while Mr. Thorne's business was still a concept." Finch laughed a short, barking sound. "Objection, Your Honor. Vague and unsubstantiated. Does she have receipts for the groceries she bought? A ledger for every cup of coffee?" This is the desperate grasping of a woman who realizes she let a winning lottery ticket slip through her fingers. The small gallery, mostly composed of Julian and Isabella's friends, tittered with amusement. Julian finally chanced to look at Evelyn, his expression a mixture of pity and annoyance. It was the look you give a stray dog you have to shoo away from your pristine porch. That look, more than anything Finch had said, broke something inside Evelyn. The dam of quiet suffering she had maintained for months finally cracked. She took a slow, deep breath, the cold courtroom air a shock to her lungs. The fear and shame that had paralyzed her began to recede, replaced by a slow-burning, diamond-hard resolve. They wanted to know about her finances. They wanted to talk about what she was owed. Fine. It was time to stop playing by their rules. She leaned over and whispered something to her lawyer. Sarah Jenkins' eyes widened in shock, then confusion, then a dawning, electrifying understanding. She straightened up, her entire demeanor changing from that of a nervous rookie to a confident professional. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice now clear and strong, cutting through the murmurs in the room, "we withdraw our previous request. It is, as Mr. Finch so crudely pointed out, inadequate." Finch smirked. Finally some sense. "So you'll be accepting my client's generous offer?" "No," Sarah said, looking directly at him. "We will be filing a new motion, a motion to dismiss the need for any spousal support whatsoever. My client has no need for Mr. Thorne's money. However, we will be seeking reimbursement for a number of personal assets left in the marital home." She paused, letting the statement hang in the air. "Assets valued conservatively at approximately $25 million. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Marcus Finch's smirk vanished, replaced by a slack-jawed gape. Julian and Isabella stared, their faces masks of pure disbelief. $25 million. From the woman in the cheap dress, the game had just changed, and Evelyn Vance was finally ready to play. The memory was so vivid it felt like yesterday. It was raining, a relentless New York City downpour that turned the streets into dark, glistening mirrors. They were huddled in their tiny fourth-floor walk-up apartment in Brooklyn, the one with the rattling radiator and the window that never quite closed. Evelyn had just come home from a 12-hour shift at the Daily Grind, a coffee shop where she was a star barista, her hands aching and smelling faintly of burnt espresso. Julian was at their rickety dining table, which was buried under a mountain of papers, his face illuminated by the glow of a laptop screen. He hadn't even noticed she'd come in. That was common in those days. His mind was always miles away, lost in the intricate world of algorithms, market trends, and financial projections. "Jules," she had said softly, placing a paper bag on the one clear corner of the table, "I brought you a sandwich. The pastrami you like." He looked up, his eyes unfocused for a moment before recognition dawned. "Oh, Ellie. Hey. I didn't hear you." He ran a hand through his already messy hair. "I think I'm onto something. A predictive algorithm for microcap stocks. It's revolutionary." She had smiled, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of his infectious passion. This was the Julian she had fallen in love with. the brilliant, driven dreamer who saw patterns in the chaos of the world that no one else could. He wasn't Julian Thorne, the future CEO then. He was just Jules the boy with a dream too big for their tiny apartment. "That's amazing," she said, unwrapping the sandwich for him. "Eat something. You've been at this for 2 days straight." He took a bite, chewing absently. "The server costs are going to be insane to backtest this properly. And I need a Bloomberg terminal subscription. That's $2,000 a month, Ellie. $2,000. He sighed, the weight of his ambition pressing down on him. "It's impossible." Evelyn looked around their apartment. Every piece of furniture was second-hand, every dish was chipped. Her clothes were from clearance racks, her one luxury a new book every month. All their money, every spare dollar from her job and his occasional freelance coding gigs, went into a savings account labeled The Dream. But it wasn't enough. The next day she took the subway to a small dusty pawn shop in the Diamond District. In her pocket was a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate gold locket intricately carved with forget-me-nots. It had been her mother's, given to her on her 16th birthday. It was the most precious thing she owned, a tangible link to a past she rarely spoke of. She walked out an hour later with $2,500 in cash, enough for the subscription and a little extra. When she gave the money to Julian that night, he was ecstatic. "Ellie Howe. Where did you get this?" "I have my ways," she'd said with a breezy smile, tucking the memory of the gruff pawnbroker and the ache in her heart into a deep, hidden corner. "Call me your angel investor." He had lifted her off her feet, spinning her around their tiny living room. "When Thorne Capital is a reality, I'll buy you 1,000 lockets. I'll buy you a diamond for every coffee you've ever served. I promise, Ellie. It's all for us." For us. That had been the mantra. The sacrifices piled up, each one a brick in the foundation of his success. She took on extra shifts, becoming a waitress at night after her barista job. She learned to patch his suits, to cook gourmet-tasting meals on a shoestring budget for the potential investors he'd bring over. She was his sounding board, his cheerleader, his unpaid assistant, and the silent, steady engine that kept his life running while he focused solely on the dream. The day Thorne Capital secured its first round of major funding was the best day of their lives. He came home, lifted her up in that same way, and they drank champagne, real expensive champagne, out of their mismatched coffee mugs. The future felt limitless. But success, Evelyn learned, was a corrosive acid. The more successful Julian became, the more the us began to feel like him. Their tiny apartment was traded for a sleek, minimalist condo overlooking Central Park. Her thrift store clothes were replaced by designer outfits he'd pick out, telling her she needed to look the part. The brilliant, passionate dreamer was slowly being replaced by a polished, calculating stranger. He began to criticize her. Her lack of a prestigious degree. Her simple hobbies of reading and gardening on their small balcony. Her friends who were nurses and teachers, not hedge fund managers and socialites. "Ellie, you're not even trying," he'd say, frustrated after a networking event where she'd spent most of her time talking to the catering staff. "These people are important. You need to engage." She had tried, but she felt like a fraud in that world of fake smiles and transactional conversations. It wasn't her. The more he pushed her to be someone else, the more she retreated into herself. Then came Isabella Sterling. Her father ran a competing older firm. A union between Julian and Isabella was more than a marriage. It was a merger. Evelyn first saw them together in a photo in a society column. Julian had his arm around Isabella's waist at a charity gala he told Evelyn he was attending with his lawyer. He looked happy. He looked like he belonged. The confrontation was cold and clinical. It didn't happen in their home, but in a neutral, sterile coffee shop, a cruel irony that wasn't lost on Evelyn. "It's not working, Evelyn," he said, not even looking at her, stirring a sugar he didn't take into his black coffee. "We want different things. I've outgrown this. We've outgrown this." "You mean you found someone more useful?" she said, her voice quiet, devoid of the tears he was clearly expecting. His eyes flickered with annoyance. That's a crude way of putting it. Isabella understands my world. She's a part of it. You were for the beginning. I'll always be grateful for that. But this is the big leagues now. He slid a piece of paper across the table. A separation agreement. The terms were insulting. He was effectively erasing her, turning 5 years of her life into a footnote. I'll be generous, he'd said, the words a slap in the face. I won't let you be destitute. Looking back now from the cold vantage point of the courtroom, Evelyn understood. He didn't just want a divorce. He wanted to retroactively invalidate their entire history. He needed to believe that he had done it all himself, that she was nothing more than a temporary phase, a piece of scaffolding to be kicked away once the skyscraper was built. By painting her as a lazy, unambitious parasite, he wasn't just trying to save money. He was trying to save his own story, rewriting it with himself as the solitary hero. And for that lie, he needed to humiliate her. He needed to make her small so he could feel big. The silence in courtroom 4B was a physical entity. It pressed in on them thick and heavy. Marcus Finch's face, usually a mask of smug control, had cycled through confusion, disbelief, and was now settling on outright fury. $25 million. Finch finally sputtered, turning to the judge as if she were his ally. Your Honor, this is absurd. It's a desperate, ludicrous tactic. What assets is she possibly referring to? A collection of used books and chipped coffee mugs. Judge Miller, however, was no longer looking at Finch. Her gaze was fixed on Sarah Jenkins, and for the first time a flicker of genuine interest lit her tired eyes. Ms. Jenkins, the judge, said, her voice dangerously level. You've made an extraordinary claim. I trust you are prepared to substantiate it. This court does not appreciate theatrics. We are, Your Honor. Sarah said, her newfound confidence radiating from her. She opened a thin file folder, one that had been sitting on her desk ignored all morning. During their marriage, Mr. Thorne and my client resided at 113 Central Park West Apartment 14A. When my client vacated the premises following their separation, she left behind several personal items she was unable to transport at the time. She slid a document across the table. This is a preliminary inventory. The first item is a painting that was hung in the main living area. It's a piece by Jean-Michel Basquiat titled Untitled Cadmium. A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. Even Julian looked confused, his brow furrowed. He glanced at Isabella, who simply shrugged, a look of bored annoyance on her face. Finch let out a derisive snort. A Basquiat. Your Honor, they had a print, a poster they bought online for $50 and had framed. Is this a joke? My client is not referring to a print, Sarah stated calmly. She is referring to the original 1984 acrylic and oil stick on canvas. It was a gift to my client on her 18th birthday. Julian actually laughed out loud this time. That's insane. Evelyn, own a Basquiat. Her father was a high school history teacher and her mother was a librarian. They lived in a suburb in Ohio. Where would she possibly get a multi-million-dollar painting? He turned to the judge, spreading his hands in a gesture of utter bewilderment. Your Honor, see what I'm dealing with? She's delusional. Evelyn watched him, her expression unreadable. She let him talk. She let him dig his own grave. He was so convinced of the narrative he had built of her simple, unremarkable past that he couldn't see the truth even as it began to assemble itself right in front of him. The second item, Sarah continued undeterred, is a Patek Philippe Grandmaster chime watch reference, 6300G. It was kept in a safe in the master bedroom closet. Mr. Thorne was aware of the safe, though he was never given the combination. Julian's face went pale. He remembered the safe. It had been installed when they moved in. Evelyn had told him it was for sentimental documents. He'd found it odd, but he'd been too busy with the firm to question it. He'd just assumed it held old family photos and letters. A Patek Philippe. The most complicated and expensive wristwatch in the world. He felt a cold knot of dread begin to form in his stomach. And the third item, Sarah said, her voice dropping slightly for dramatic effect, is a set of bearer bonds issued by the United States Treasury with a face value of $10 million. They were stored in the same safe. The courtroom erupted. Finch was on his feet shouting, "Your Honor, this is a fabrication. A fantasy. She's inventing a treasure chest to extort my client. We demand proof, provenance documentation." "We have it," Sarah said simply. She pulled out another document. "This is a notarized statement from the executor of my client's family estate along with insurance riders for the specified items, all under the name Evelyn Vance. Blackwood." The name landed in the room like a grenade. Blackwood. Not a common name, but in the circles Julian and Isabella now moved in, it was a name spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for royalty or gods. It was the name associated with Blackwood Industries, the reclusive multinational conglomerate with interests in everything from shipping to aerospace to rare earth minerals. It was a name synonymous with old money, immense power, and impenetrable privacy. Isabella Sterling gasped, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted from Sarah to Evelyn. She was finally looking at Evelyn, truly seeing her for the first time. The cheap dress, the quiet demeanor, it all suddenly seemed like a costume, a deliberate disguise. Julian was frozen, his mind racing, trying to connect the dots. Blackwood. Evelyn Vance Blackwood. He remembered her talking about her father, how they were estranged. She'd said he was a difficult man who disapproved of her choices. Julian had pictured a stubborn small-town teacher who wanted his daughter to marry a local boy, not a brilliant financier. He'd never once asked for her father's name. It had seemed so unimportant, a relic from a past she and he had left behind. Blackwood. Finch repeated, his voice suddenly weak, the bluster gone. As in, Alexander Blackwood. The very same, Sarah confirmed. Evelyn is his only child, his sole heir. She chose to live under her mother's maiden name, Vance, to live a normal life. To find a partner who would love her for who she was, not for the name she carried. Sarah's eyes met Julian's, and her gaze was filled with ice. A regrettable and clearly failed experiment. The truth slammed into Julian with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a lie. It was an entire universe of deceit he had been too arrogant and self-absorbed to notice. Evelyn, the simple girl. Evelyn, the barista. Evelyn, the domestic anchor. It had all been a choice. Her sacrifice wasn't selling a locket. Her sacrifice was giving up a life of unimaginable luxury to be with him, to believe in him. And he had thrown it all away. He looked at her, then truly looked at her. The woman he had called parasitic, unambitious, and delusional. She sat there poised and calm, her expression not of triumph, but of a deep, profound sorrow. The sorrow of a woman who had gambled her heart on a man, and lost in the most spectacular way possible. In that moment, Julian Thorne didn't just see the heiress to the Blackwood fortune. He saw the greatest mistake of his entire life. The winning lottery ticket he hadn't just let slip through his fingers, he had torn it to shreds and thrown it in the face of the woman who handed it to him. Isabella was already inching her chair away from him, her face a mask of horror and calculation. She wasn't looking at a fiancé anymore. She was looking at the stupidest man in the world. The courtroom was in a state of suspended animation, caught in the aftershock of the name Blackwood. Judge Miller, for her part, had regained her composure with the practiced ease of a woman who had seen every form of human drama. She banged her gavel once, the sharp crack echoing in the stunned silence. "Order," she commanded. "Mr. Finch, sit down. Ms. Jenkins, you have made a claim that changes the entire nature of these proceedings. You mentioned an executor. You mentioned documentation. But in a case this unusual, the court will require more." Marcus Finch, seeing a sliver of opportunity, scrambled to his feet again. "Exactly, Your Honor. This is hearsay. Papers can be forged. Stories can be invented. They have to produce more than a name. They have to produce a person." Where is this mythical Alexander Blackwood? Why isn't he here to confirm this preposterous story? It was a valid point. Alexander Blackwood was notoriously private, a veritable ghost who hadn't been photographed in public for over 2 decades. The idea of him appearing in a divorce court in Lower Manhattan was laughable. Finch knew it, and a bit of his swagger returned. He was betting it was all a bluff, an incredibly audacious one, but a bluff nonetheless. Sarah Jenkins didn't flinch. She glanced at the clock on the courtroom wall, then towards the heavy oak doors at the back. My client's father is currently on a transoceanic flight and cannot be reached. His privacy is, as Mr. Finch knows, of paramount importance. However, she said, her timing impeccable, we were prepared for the court's need for direct verification. We have a witness. A witness? The judge asked, her eyebrows raised. Your witness list was submitted last week. It contained only one name, Evelyn Vance. This is an unscheduled character and financial witness. Your Honor, Sarah admitted. But their testimony is vital to corroborate my client's identity and financial standing, a matter which the petitioner's counsel has aggressively and repeatedly called into question. Given the circumstances, we believe their testimony is essential for justice to be served. Finch was livid. Objection. This is a procedural ambush. We have had no time to prepare, no opportunity for discovery on this mystery witness. This is a complete violation of protocol. Ordinarily, Mr. Finch, I would agree with you, Judge Miller said, her tone sharp. However, you are the one who spent the last hour painting Ms. Vance as a destitute liar. You opened this door. You demanded proof. Ms. Jenkins is offering to provide it. I'm going to allow it. But she warned Sarah this had better be substantive. Thank you, Your Honor, Sarah said with a respectful nod. She turned toward the back of the room. The defense calls Arthur Pendleton to the stand. If the name Blackwood was a grenade, Arthur Pendleton was a precision-guided missile. To the average person, the name meant nothing. But in the rarefied air of global finance and corporate law, the world Julian and Finch inhabited, Arthur Pendleton was a legend. He was the CEO of the Blackwood Industries parent company, the public face of the invisible empire. He was Alexander Blackwood's right hand, his gatekeeper, and his most trusted advisor for over 30 years. They called him the Viceroy. Julian's blood ran cold. He had seen Pendleton speak once at a Davos summit he'd paid a fortune to attend. The man exuded an aura of quiet, unassailable power that made brash new money players like Julian feel like children. The idea of Arthur Pendleton walking into this courtroom on behalf of Evelyn was impossible. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. 2 men in dark, severe suits entered first, their eyes scanning the room with professional efficiency. They were clearly security, and then between them walked Arthur Pendleton. He was in his late 60s, tall and wiry, with a full head of silver hair and eyes the color of a winter sky. He wasn't dressed in the flashy style of lawyers like Finch. He wore a simple, impeccably tailored gray suit, a white shirt, and a dark blue tie. His clothes didn't shout money. They whispered it from a great and inaccessible distance. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace down the central aisle, his gaze fixed forward. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The air crackled with his presence. He passed Julian's table without a flicker of acknowledgement. Julian felt an involuntary urge to shrink in his seat, to become invisible. Pendleton's very existence in this room was a verdict on Julian's life, a judgment far more potent than any the judge could deliver. He had not just divorced a woman, he had insulted an empire. Arthur Pendleton reached the witness stand and stood patiently waiting to be sworn in. He looked at Evelyn, and for a single fleeting moment his stern expression softened into one of paternal affection and concern. It was a look that confirmed everything. Marcus Finch sank into his chair, his face ashen. All the fight had gone out of him. He was a shark, yes, but he had just discovered that he was swimming in an ocean that belonged to a blue whale, and he had made the fatal mistake of trying to bite it. Isabella Sterling slowly, deliberately picked up her crocodile leather handbag from the floor. She placed it in her lap and opened it, her movements precise and mechanical. She was no longer looking at anyone. She was calculating her escape. The merger was off. The court clerk, a man who had seen decades of mundane disputes, fumbled slightly as he administered the oath to Arthur Pendleton. The witness's quiet gravitas seemed to unnerve even him. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" "I do," Pendleton replied, his voice calm and clear, carrying easily through the silent room. Sarah Jenkins approached the stand. "Mr. Pendleton, could you please state your full name and occupation for the court?" "My name is Arthur Hemmings Pendleton. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Blackwood Global Industries." Each word was delivered with precision, a statement of irrefutable fact. "And in what capacity do you know my client, Ms. Evelyn Vance?" Pendleton turned his gaze slightly to look at Evelyn, a fond, almost sad smile touching his lips for an instant. "I have known Evelyn since the day she was born. I am her godfather, and I am the executor of her family's trust." Sarah nodded. "Can you confirm for the court her relationship to your employer, Mr. Alexander Blackwood?" "Evelyn is Mr. Blackwood's only child and sole heir," Pendleton stated simply. "Her legal name is Evelyn Vance Blackwood. Vance was her mother's name. After her mother's passing and upon entering adulthood, Evelyn made a personal decision to use the name Vance exclusively in her public life. It was a choice born of a desire for privacy and normalcy, a choice her father, though he may not have fully understood it, begrudgingly respected. Finch, seeing his career flashing before his eyes, knew he had to do something, anything. He weakly rose to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is all very touching, but it's not relevant to the division of marital assets." Judge Miller glared at him. "Mr. Finch, you spent the better part of an hour arguing that Ms. Vance's financial standing was zero, and that her character was that of a common grifter. This testimony speaks directly to both of those assertions." "Overruled. Sit down." Finch sat, his face burning with humiliation. Sarah continued. "Mr. Pendleton, we have submitted an inventory of 3 specific items: a Basquiat painting, a Patek Philippe watch, and a series of bearer bonds, which my client claims are her personal non-marital property. Can you speak to the authenticity of these claims?" "I certainly can," Pendleton said. "The Basquiat Untitled Cadmium was purchased by Mr. Blackwood at a Sotheby's auction in 2015. It was a gift for Evelyn's 18th birthday. I personally oversaw the acquisition and the drafting of the deed of gift. It is her sole property. Its last appraisal valued it at $17 million. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. $17 million. For one painting. Julian felt dizzy. The numbers were so large they were almost meaningless. He remembered that painting. It had hung over their sofa. He'd always thought it was a chaotic, ugly mess. He'd once joked about replacing it with something more soothing. Evelyn had just given him a strange, sad look and changed the subject. "The Patek Philippe." Pendleton continued his tone as even as if he were reading a grocery list. "Was also a gift. From me, actually. For her graduation from Columbia University. It is one of only 7 in existence. Its value is approximately $3.5 million. Julian's mind reeled. Columbia Evelyn had told him she had a simple state college degree. Another lie. A lie to make herself seem smaller, less intimidating, more like him. The generosity of her deception was in its own way more devastating than the wealth itself. "And the bearer bonds," Sarah prompted. "Those were placed in a trust for Evelyn by her late mother, Catherine Vance Blackwood. They were intended as an emergency fund for Evelyn to be kept entirely separate from the Blackwood family finances to give her a measure of independence. I can confirm their face value is $10 million. All of these items predate her marriage to Mr. Thorne by several years. They are unequivocally her personal property." Pendleton paused, then shifted his gaze, pinning Julian Thorne with a look as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. Your Honor, if I may add a personal observation, Pendleton said, his voice taking on a harder edge. For the past 6 years, I have watched Evelyn live a life of profound modesty. She has done so to test a hypothesis that she could find a partner who valued her spirit, her intelligence, and her heart above all else. She actively hid a personal fortune that dwarfs Mr. Thorne's entire company, not out of deceit but out of hope. She worked grueling, thankless jobs not because she had to, but to support the man she loved, to allow his dream to flourish. She contributed every dollar she earned and every ounce of her energy to their partnership. He let the words sink in. The accusation I heard upon entering this courtroom that she was a parasite, an anchor, a woman of no ambition, is not only a grotesque falsehood, but the single greatest misjudgment of character I have ever witnessed in my 68 years. Mr. Thorne did not have a leech for a wife. He had a benefactress of unimaginable generosity. He was a man who was handed the keys to a kingdom, and instead of entering, he complained about the weight of the keys and threw them away for a handful of shiny pebbles. The metaphor delivered in Pendleton's devastatingly calm voice was brutal. It stripped Julian bare, exposing his shallow ambition and catastrophic lack of perception for everyone to see. Isabella Sterling had heard enough. Quietly, without a word to Julian, she stood up. She smoothed down her dress, picked up her purse, and with the posture of a queen abandoning a fallen state, she walked calmly out of the courtroom. The soft click of the door closing behind her was the sound of Julian's future ending. Julian didn't watch her go. He couldn't take his eyes off Evelyn. She was looking at Pendleton, and her eyes were shining with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of gratitude. For the first time in months, someone had spoken the truth. Someone had seen her. "I have no further questions for this witness, Your Honor," Sarah Jenkins said, returning to her seat. Judge Miller looked at the shell-shocked Marcus Finch. "Mr. Finch, cross-examination." Finch looked at Pendleton, who met his gaze with unnerving calm. "Cross-examine the Viceroy of the Blackwood Empire. It would be professional suicide." "No, Your Honor." Finch mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. "No questions." Judge Miller surveyed the scene before her. The petitioner's side was in disarray. Julian Thorne sat alone, a man hollowed out, the architecture of his arrogance having collapsed in on itself. His lawyer, Marcus Finch, was shuffling papers with no purpose, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The respondent's side, by contrast, was a bastion of quiet strength. "Well," the judge said, her voice laced with an irony so dry it could start a fire, "this has certainly been an illuminating morning. The court finds the testimony of Mr. Pendleton to be credible and compelling." She fixed her gaze on Julian. "Mr. Thorne, your petition to deny spousal support is of course granted, as the respondent has graciously withdrawn her request. As for the matter of the personal assets, Ms. Jenkins has your client made arrangements to retrieve her property." "We have, Your Honor." Sarah confirmed. "Mr. Pendleton's security team is on standby. We request a court order granting my client immediate and exclusive access to the residence at 113 Central Park West for a period of 2 hours to retrieve her belongings." "So ordered," the judge said, banging her gavel. It felt less like a closing and more like a final nail being hammered into the coffin of Julian's life. "And as for the petitioner's generous offer of a $5,000 settlement," she looked at Julian with utter disdain, "the court dismisses that offer as insulting, made in bad faith, and based on a complete and willful misrepresentation of the facts. This proceeding is concluded." The gavel fell one last time. It was over. As people began to stir, the muted buzz of shocking gossip filling the room, Arthur Pendleton stepped down from the witness stand. He walked over to the defense table and placed a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and kind. Evelyn finally looked up, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She nodded, managing a small, watery smile. "Thank you, Arthur. For everything." "Alexander wanted to come himself," Pendleton admitted. "I had to talk him out of it. He would have bought the courthouse and had it demolished with Mr. Thorne still inside." Despite everything, a small laugh escaped Evelyn's lips. It felt like the first ray of sunshine after a long storm. She stood, and for the first time that day she squared her shoulders and looked across the aisle at the man who had been her husband. Julian was staring at her, his face a pathetic mask of desperation and dawning horror. As she began to walk away, flanked by Pendleton and her lawyer, he finally snapped out of his trance. "Ellie." He called out, his voice cracking. He stumbled from his chair, rushing to intercept her before she reached the aisle. "Ellie, wait. We need to talk." Pendleton's security men moved instantly, stepping between Julian and Evelyn, forming a silent, immovable wall. "Please," Julian begged, his voice, pleading, his eyes wild with regret. "I didn't know. I swear I had no idea. I made a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake." Evelyn stopped. She looked at him, not over the shoulders of the security guards, but by stepping slightly to the side, meeting his gaze directly. The look in her eyes was not one of anger or hatred. It was something far worse, pity. It was the look one gives to something broken and insignificant. "You're right, Julian," she said, her voice steady and clear, carrying in the now quiet courtroom. "You did make a mistake. But your mistake wasn't leaving me. And it wasn't not knowing about my family." She took a step closer, forcing him to see the profound truth of her words. "Your mistake was believing that a person's worth is measured by their bank account. You mocked me for being a barista, a librarian. You were ashamed of me because I wasn't a CEO or a socialite. You didn't see any value in kindness or loyalty or sacrifice unless it directly served your ambition." She let the silence hang for a moment. "The money doesn't change who I am. I'm still the woman who served coffee to support you. I'm still the woman who sold her mother's locket for you. The only thing that has changed is that now you see that woman as valuable, and that Julian is why we are over. You didn't fall in love with Evelyn Vance, and you certainly don't deserve Evelyn Blackwood." With that, she turned her back on him. She didn't look back as she walked out of the courtroom, Arthur Pendleton at her side, leaving Julian Thorne standing alone in the ruins of his own making, a desperately poor man who had for a brief, shining moment held all the wealth in the world in his hands and had been too blind to see it. The news of the courtroom drama spread through New York's elite circles like wildfire. The story was just too delicious, the meteoric rise and spectacular self-destruction of Julian Thorne. His firm Thorne Capital imploded within a week. Investors, spooked by his catastrophic lack of judgment, pulled their money out. His reputation as a brilliant visionary was replaced by a new one, the fool who divorced the Blackwood heiress. No one wanted to do business with a man who couldn't recognize a billion-dollar asset when he was married to it. He lost the condo, his business, and what few real friends he had. He tried calling Evelyn hundreds of times, but the calls went unanswered. He was a pariah, a walking cautionary tale whispered about at galas and in boardrooms. The shiny pebbles he had chosen Isabella status, a fleeting sense of superiority, had all turned to dust in his hands. 3 months passed. To the gossiping circles of New York's elite, the story of Julian Thorne's downfall had been a thrilling but fleeting drama. He was yesterday's news, a cautionary tale that had already been replaced by newer scandals. Evelyn Vance Blackwood had simply vanished, retreating behind the impenetrable walls that the Blackwood name afforded. Many assumed she had simply returned to a life of quiet, reclusive luxury, the brief, messy chapter of her public life now closed. They were wrong. The bomb dropped not in a society column, but on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. The headline was stark printed in bold, uncompromising ink. Blackwood heiress launches $500 million Vance Foundation for Educational and Arts Access. Beneath it was a photograph of Evelyn taken at a press conference held not in some sterile corporate ballroom but in the majestic book-lined hall of the New York Public Library. She looked transformed. The timid, haunted woman from the courtroom was gone, replaced by a leader. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored navy blue dress, her hair cut in a sharp professional bob. There was no ostentatious jewelry, only the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her power. Her eyes, once downcast, were now clear-focused, and held a fire that no one, least of all Julian, had ever seen before. The launch of the Vance Foundation was a meticulously planned statement. The guest list was not a Rolodex of Wall Street titans and vapid socialites. It was composed of university presidents, celebrated poets, struggling playwrights, community organizers, and public school teachers. It was a room full of the very people Julian's world considered insignificant. Her speech, delivered without notes, was a masterpiece of grace and purpose. For a portion of my life, she began, her voice steady and resonant. I chose to live under my mother's name, Vance. She was a librarian. My father, a man of industry, built empires of steel and commerce. But my mother built empires of the mind. She believed that access to knowledge, to art, to beauty was not a luxury, but a fundamental human right. She taught me that a person's true net worth isn't found on a balance sheet, but in the richness of their curiosity and the depth of their empathy. She paused, her gaze sweeping over the rapt audience. The world has enough foundations dedicated to building bigger buildings. This foundation is dedicated to building bigger minds. The Vance Foundation will be dedicated to ensuring that the next great novelist isn't lost because her local library closed down, that the next scientific genius isn't overlooked because he couldn't afford tuition, and that the value of a quiet life dedicated to knowledge is celebrated, not mocked. The final line was a subtle, perfectly aimed dart, and the message was clear. This was not an act of charity. It was a reordering of values. In a subsequent rare one-on-one interview with a respected journalist, the inevitable question arose. "Your story has captivated the public," the interviewer said gently. "Many see what happened to your ex-husband as a form of cosmic revenge. Do you?" Evelyn's smile was thoughtful, devoid of malice. "I don't believe in revenge. Revenge is a conversation with the past, and I am far more interested in building the future. What happened in that courtroom wasn't about punishing Julian. It was about my own liberation. For years I allowed someone else to define my worth, to dictate my story. I made myself small to make him feel big, believing that was the nature of love and support. My mistake was in thinking that my value was something that could be diminished by someone else's opinion." She leaned forward, her sincerity palpable. "My father's name, Blackwood, provides the resources for this work. It's a tool, a powerful one. But my mother's name, Vance, provides the mission. This foundation is my voice. It's a testament to the belief that true strength isn't about how much you can acquire, but how much you can give. My story isn't about a secret heiress. It's about a librarian's daughter finally putting her mother's lessons into practice." Far across town, in a dimly lit bar in Queens that smelled of stale beer and regret, Julian Thorne watched the interview on a flickering television mounted over the counter. He was nursing a cheap whiskey, the amber liquid doing little to numb the perpetual ache in his soul. He had lost everything. His firm was a bankrupt shell, his condo had been sold to cover his debts, and his name was a punchline. He was wearing a frayed shirt, his face unshaven, the ghost of the Tom Ford-wearing titan he once was. As Evelyn spoke, every word was a fresh torment. A librarian's daughter. He remembered mocking her mother's profession, the value of a quiet life. He remembered calling her unambitious. He saw the Basquiat he'd called an ugly mess, now the cornerstone of a museum exhibit funded by her foundation. He saw the brilliant, kind, and profoundly wealthy woman he had cast aside for a shallow socialite who hadn't returned a single one of his calls. He hadn't just misjudged her finances, he had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of value itself. His ambition had been a raging fire that had given him a brief, brilliant light before consuming him completely, leaving him as nothing but cold ash. He finally understood. He hadn't just lost a fortune. He had lost a universe. Evelyn, meanwhile, was miles away from any thought of him. The interview was over. The galas and press conferences were done for the day. She was at a small, underfunded community library in the Bronx, one of the first recipients of a Vance grant. There were no cameras here. She sat on a small stool in the children's section reading a storybook to a small group of wide-eyed kids. In this quiet, unassuming space, surrounded by the smell of old paper and youthful imagination, she was truly home. She was not Evelyn Blackwood, the heiress, Nor was she Evelyn Vance, the mocked ex-wife. She was simply Evelyn, a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, not hardened but illuminated, finally building an empire of her own, one book, one mind, one quiet act of kindness at a time. Evelyn's journey wasn't just about revealing a secret identity, it was about revealing her true self, a self she had hidden even from herself. She walked into that courtroom a victim, and walked out a victor, not because of her money, but because she finally reclaimed her own story. It's a powerful reminder that our worth is never defined by someone else's opinion or their inability to see our value. It's defined by our own integrity, kindness, and the strength to stand up for who we are. What do you think was the biggest mistake Julian made? Was it his greed, his arrogance, or his simple failure to see the amazing person right in front of him? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you were moved by Evelyn's story of humiliation and ultimate triumph, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribing to the channel for more powerful real-life stories. Your support helps us continue to bring these incredible journeys to light. Thank you for watching.